Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Budget Line of Business, fourth annual Intro to Budget Form. This session is Intro to Budget Formulation 2. Thank you for joining us. For those that were not with us in Budget Formulation 1, the presenters for today will be Rick Taylor and Andy Pavord, and we will just resume from Budget Formulation 1 going into Budget Formulation 2. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and there may be some questions you can answer throughout. Please feel free to come to join us on chat to answer any questions available from our presenters. Please take it on.
Okay, thank you, Janice.
So Rick, thank you.
So as Janice said, we're picking up where we left off in the last set of slides, just have a few more to go. So in summary, the A11 provides guidance for all these things. So really, it's one of those things, if you have a question, take a look at the A11 first. It probably can answer your question. And then, if you're in the central budget office, work according to your protocols to talk to your OMB examiner and ask them any questions you may have to clarify what's in the A11. But the A11's in there, and when it first comes out, he said it ought to be one of the first downloads that morning to go through that and look for new information and new guidance. So a quick question: should your agency's budget request provide information about changes in employment levels proposed for the budget year? What are your thoughts?
You put your answers in the chat.
There we go. Yep. Yeah, I think that was sort of a softball. I mean, employment levels are a major component of almost every agency's overall cost. So, changing employment levels up or down would be, or shifting them from one project or area to another would be a major thing to want to discuss in the budget request. Okay, this chart again is a drill down on the agency internal budget formulation process. You can see we're already back in February, so we're really, kind of where we are right now, February, March time frame. Agencies are probably, again, it might be delayed a little bit with a transition year, but typically agencies have issued their budget guidance internally and are now working with their departments and bureaus to come up with their internal budget request to their internal agency leadership. Most agencies follow some variation of this. This isn't meant to be authoritative. It's just a description of what's typical. And again, within the agency, the bureau budget request can take all sorts of forms. Maybe it's like a point paper or issue paper type format that management then decides, okay, take this one forward. No, this one we're not going to do this year. That format. It could be a full up budget request. It really just depends, their style of making decisions and the information they like to see. The budget guidance memo is important though, because it shapes, what the organizations are going to submit to the agency budget office. It provides instructions to them about what to include and how to submit it. The policy guidance informs the bureau staff about specific policy goals the agency leadership wants to include going forward to OMB and Congress. Technical guidance talks about how to request the budget authority. Are there certain formats or certain data elements you want to see? I mean, that is a big driver to make it easier to roll up or summarize the budget if people are submitting things in a consistent format. If some things come in Word documents and others in spreadsheets, and it's going to make a lot of work for the budget staff to be able to put that all together. The clear policy guidance is really essential. You want people working towards the same ends. It's a waste of time for people to develop requests that are not what the agency wants to go forward with. If we're going to have an Apple initiative, and me talking about planting banana trees is probably not going to, it's just going to be a waste of time for everybody. So communicating that policy guidance clearly and getting people to understand that's where we're going this year is very important. It makes it easier on everybody, and it makes it a lot simpler for the staff when things are kind of all aligned that way. Getting that guidance right, every aspect of it, technical and policy, and the schedule, of course, when things are going to be submitted, is very important for a successful budget submission cycle.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Andy.
Okay, next slide. So I'll take over from here. Why is agency budget guidance so important? Because this is how you communicate and coordinate the budget formulation process to the people who do the real work of budget formulation. So this is how the department lets the analysts in the programs and offices and bureaus know what to do. So policy guidance enables programs to focus their effort on budget proposals that are consistent with leadership priorities. So it's a waste of time for people to do work on things that are just inconsistent with what the presidential priorities are. So that avoids wasted effort. The technical guidance ensures that decision makers get the right information in time to make good decisions. So clear data guidance ensures that data can be turned into information that decision makers can use. The standard formats enable quality control and allow you to roll up information and data into departmental summaries and allows you to transform data into briefings for decision makers. And having a schedule ensures that agencies have time to produce quality products and that you can coordinate with other functions, because part of formulation is coordinating with policy, with IT, HR, and other support functions. So next slide. So policy guidance, and we have to emphasize, what I think you all know, that political leadership is the sole source of legitimate policy guidance. It's a core democratic value that the source of policy is our elected leadership. Civil servants must never substitute their priorities for that of elected leaders and their appointees. So our role as civil servants or contractors is to make sure that we're following the political guidance given to us and incorporating that guidance into the budget formulation process. Now, there's different ways that political leadership gives guidance. And there's really two types. One is a priority statement where they say, these are our priorities. They describe the policy priorities of the administration sort of in narrative terms. But there's also policy guidance given in terms of targets, which are specific limits on the amount of budget authority that a program is allowed to request. So targets are, in fact, a form of policy guidance because they frame what the budget that the agency can request. And it's good to make sure that you do this by asking questions, but you try to make sure that you understand how the priorities and the targets are consistent. So next slide. And so there's sources of policy guidance. There is the agency political leadership. And right now, that's the key thing. Agency political leadership is will provide the guidance. But also, OMB also, as the arm of the president, also provides guidance. And it does so through a spring guidance letter that's normally sent out. And then there's informal guidance. And there's also Congress, which can provide guidance through congressional reports and things like that. Next slide. So the leaders get to set the policy priorities. I'm hammering that home. I'm saying it over and over again because it's their job to interpret and apply the president's priority. It's OMB's job to enforce the president's priority. And they're going to do that when they review your budget requests. Anything that's not consistent with the president's priorities will obviously be disapproved. But you have to figure out how do they take different approaches to communicate their priorities. Sometimes they're very specific, sometimes they're very general, and it depends. Now we're in the early stages of an administration, so we don't really know. A lot of political appointees are not in place yet. They're new. We're trying to figure it out, and so we as civil servants have to ask the questions to try to get the guidance. Sometimes it's very specific, sometimes it's very general, and sometimes you have to kind of listen to what they're saying to the press to figure out what they want. Next slide. Agency strategic plans, which are not being done yet, so I'm going to kind of skip over this. But when they are produced according to the law, or maybe they'll have a different idea how to do this, they can be a source of guidance. Next slide. OMB does provide guidance, and it's signed by the OMB director, who is, of course, a political appointee. This guidance, it's usually done in the spring or early summer to get the process, the formulation process kickstarted. And they may or may not provide targets. And we're going to wait and see what the next official guidance of OMB is, and you'll work through your political leadership to figure out what that guidance. But a key thing that OMB does establish is the due date for the OMB submission. Next slide. Congress does provide guidance, ultimate guidance, in the sense that you need to understand their authorizing legislation. It's a good idea to understand the priorities of appropriators just from previous hearings and looking at the members and the staff, and we review the report language to understand what they want. And that's a good idea. But again, the political leadership is the ultimate interpreter of what is going on in Congress. Next slide. And we talked about budget targets, and usually they can do an across the board percent change, and sometimes they exempt priority programs for cuts, and sometimes they set specific increases for priority programs. In this case, there might be increases for border security and things like that. This will not be happening in this particular administration, I suspect, but in previous administrations, they have had this philosophy of let them ask for what they really need. And this does tend to lead to wasted effort as agencies trying to work on producing a bunch of stuff that will never be accepted. So next slide. One way to do also is for the Departmental Budget Office to provide scenarios. And these are often guidance levels that require agencies to submit budget requests at different funding levels. So it might be, current funding level -5, -10%, right? And scenarios have to be designed to drive agencies to reveal their real priorities. That's what you're trying to do. Find out what are the priorities so you can understand where it's appropriate to cut or give increases depending on the policy priorities of the president. It's a bad idea for a budget office to ask for scenarios unless the budget office is going to use them in a meaningful and visible way. You've all probably worked with scenarios, but doing scenarios for scenario's sake is a waste and it is not a good idea. And so if you have unrealistic scenarios, either too high or too low, so like if in this environment you ask for a scenario plus 20%, that's probably not a waste of time, right? Next slide. The role of the budget staff. The budget staff should aggressively seek political guidance as soon as possible. You want to ask for meetings to, and try to make sure that the new leadership, which often comes from business, can be educated about the process. Ensure political appointees are aware of OMB guidance. Sometimes they're not. Be especially attentive during transitions, which are going through now, and then try to work with them to make sure that the budget targets in the policy part are consistent with the technical guidance. So next slide. So that's the end of part one, and we'll get back. It's back to you, Rick, on the next slides.
Yep, let me switch over. All right, you should be seeing the new slides. Let me just arrange some windows here a little bit on my desktop to get them where I can make them work. All right, great. So we'll skip through that parts. So we're in the list of objectives. We're down partial way through the list, and we're going to go through the bottom half of that list. We'll look at more about the OMB review and passback and settlement, highlight the process of production of the president's budget, and describe some links between budget formulation and execution. So technical guidance, as we said, it structures the data and narratives to support decision making. So this ensures that you don't get 27 different ways of describing the budget by each bureau, and helps them tell their story because it makes that consistent, and then you can concentrate on the substance and you're not dealing with formatting and things like that. especially is helpful if you have a system, a budget system that guides people and has them submit their request in a structured environment, and then reports and things can be run and analysis can be done. If you're still using spreadsheets, that's a time immemorial. It's been going on for a long time, but it just makes for a little bit more work, a little bit more effort to clean things up. But again, a good structured spreadsheet can go a long way to help you get that stuff together. And enforcing that with your bureaus that they need to use that will make your life a lot easier. The components of the technical guidance will be the type of data to submit. In other words, what fiscal years, what has to be included, all those sort of things. The formats, how you want them submitted and what way. Again, a structured spreadsheet will help a lot and keep things from being sort of all over the map. Guidance on how to request new initiatives. So this is, if an agency or a bureau component wants to request more funding in a different area, there should be clear guidance about how to do that, how to display that, and how to describe it. How to do the narratives. Again, guidance both for how to write good narratives, and there's a BLoB class on that available on their website, so I would refer you to there. And those are true of budget narratives internally within an agency and narratives that go outside the agency. Good, concise, specific budget narratives will help at every stage of the process. And lastly, the schedule with the deadlines. Late submissions are not going to be able to really be included very often because the process has got to move on. As Andy said, OMB has issued a due date, let's say September 5th, and most agencies are very reluctant to surpass that due date. So, sort of the deadlines work backwards from there. Sorry, I hadn't turned my camera on. So it's really important to maintain that schedule and to make sure people understand it so they can work towards it. For data formatting, again, that helps with quality control, compiling into departmental summaries, and transforming those into briefing materials, both internally and execute differently. And as I said, spreadsheets can work. They've worked for a long time, but they require significant work to compile and quality control and transform into briefing materials. Plus, then there's also troubles with transferring figures from spreadsheets to briefing materials, especially when revisions are made. The business intelligence such as Power BI and things of that nature can help a lot. But really the best alternative is to have a budget system that can compile and transform this data for you and keeps it consistent and enforces formatting and things of that nature. It's best to align any sort of format, whether it's spreadsheets or your budget system, with the A11 concepts and definitions. That way you don't have to translate things from your internal budget submission to your OMB submission. So using similar object classes or similar account codes, in fact, I want to say similar, using the same account codes will make that much easier to transition from an internal budget to the OMB submission. The types of data. So it really comes down to a style, what an agency wants to do, and it may be different for different programs. But you can take an approach of a high-level estimate. Do you want to see the big picture numbers, again, to kind of get, that's a great idea, we want to do that, and we think it's going to cost about $10 million, but we'll wait until, later on in the process to drill down into object class and things of that nature. Or you might want that detail up front. You might want to have the programs do that discipline, exercise that so it's ready to go. It really depends on the budgetary style or the decision-making style of your leadership. But either way can be done. It just depends on what people's preferences are. Incremental versus zero-based. So lately we've heard a lot about zero-based budgeting. So this was been in here, but it comes up from time to time. Zero-based budgeting is, basically starting with zero and justifying every dollar. And it has a certain logical value to it, but it requires bureaus to justify every expenses. It can be used to identify excess or wasteful spending. The concept is that we're going to evaluate everything from the ground up. Whereas incremental budgets take the assumptions that last year's budget was reasonable and we're only asking for or justifying an increment to that budget or defending, if there's a cut to it, what the impact of that reduction will be. The type of adjustments in an incremental phase can be inflationary or cost of business outside the agency's controls, or what's called the current services level. In other words, the cost to do the same thing next year, just with the different cost structure. And it can then also deal with initiatives or new ideas or new areas we want to do or expansions we want to do and price those two areas separately. The incremental process is really aligned with the budgetary process. If you look back at the legislative, the proposed legislation, it takes last year's amount and marks it up to the new year amount. So there's an inherent sort of incrementalism in that. And it implies again that last year's budget request was reasonable and now carrying it forward. The zero-based, again, starts with a clean slate and has very detailed analysis, which is very time consuming. The other challenge with zero-based budgeting is how to include common costs and other things like information technology services, human resources support, facilities. How are those factored into a program cost, and how are those shared or applied to a program so that the program cost reflects all of its costs and those costs aren't just left out? Because people have to have information systems and HR support and space to work in. The narratives. So the narrative is often overlooked, or I'll at least say people think budget analysts work mainly on numbers, and my experience has been they work just as much on narratives. The level of narrative and the quality of narrative will do more for getting the budget request forward than just about anything else. It really depends, again, on the level of analysis the office will conduct. If the office does not do an independent analysis, then the guidance may request only a short summary from the program offices. And if that's what the executive decision makers want. If the budget office is going to do an independent analysis, then they probably will want a more robust narrative, really describing what is going to be done with the funding requested. Some agencies take the approach of writing, kind of a rough draft and getting the detailed narratives up front. It's more work in the summer and less work in December, and it makes the OMB clearance easier because the language has already been laid down. It just depends on the agency's style and what they prefer. And again, there's a class that BLOB presents on writing better budget narratives in either at the MAX site or on their website. Janice can provide more information. So some of the budget stories that are often used, to kind of frame a budget. For the base budget, it's trying to communicate that we're using our base funding, our current funding, in the most efficient way possible. We're scrubbing the requirements. We're making sure that we're using the funding efficiently and doing the best we can with it. And it's also often good to describe ways in which the agency is still seeking those incremental efficiencies. Maybe it's through system improvements, or maybe it's through process improvements, but you're seeking to do the best you can with the resources you have. For funding increases, the stories often take the shape of kind of what those are describing. We're going to increase the quantity of a desired service. We may increase the quality of it. So maybe we're hiring more, let's say, field examiners because there's more we need to inspect or more we need to oversee, or we're going to start changing the job requirements for our field examiners so they have different qualitative abilities. Maybe they're going to be full-up accountants instead of financial analysts in order to review, a regulatory, be able to look more into an agency's finances if that's the sort of regulation environment you're involved. It might be to justify an increase in efficiency, that we need to buy a system so that we can achieve lower costs in the future. It might be to mitigate a risk. Maybe you have an audit finding or a GAO report that says, the agency's at risk for this because they're not able to do these certain things, and maybe resources will be required to close that gap. And then lastly, you can use additional funds to remediate some injustice that's, been observed or been perceived. Sorry, my mouse is acting a little bit wonky here, so let me get onto the button for, there we go. Performance measurement. Again, as Andy said, this relates to the strategic plans and the GPRA stuff, the Government Performance and Results Act. So I would say at this stage, look at the A11 when it comes out and evaluate how that can be incorporated into your budget. So it may change a lot. So, but the idea is that the parts of the budget should hang together. Risk management is also a thing. Identifying risks, evaluating those risks, and describing the resources that might be required to mitigate those risks. OMB doesn't specify in many cases how this is to be done. So it's really important to work with your agency risk management office and with your RMO, unfortunately has the same acronym, at OMB to figure out what the OMB expects to see in this area. So the Bureau budget submission is really the first input to the budget process. If it's garbage in, then it's garbage out. If it's not put together well, if the justifications aren't done well, if the numbers don't work, it's tough to get it much better from there because the process starts rolling and the time frames get shorter and shorter. It's really important to make a quality submission to your department to be there and be ready to move on with things. Most times, if a department encounters troubles with the Bureau's budget, they just don't have the time to necessarily fix it. They're going to move on to bureaus that have their requests together, and we'll maybe circle back if they can, but often there's just not enough time. So having a quality submission to your department is really key, because that enables sound planning across the department. They can put things together and look at it and make better decisions when they're not having to go through and sort of sort through things. Again, that's why we want to comply with the agency budget guidance, because if kind of going around it or trying to do something innovative maybe can make things difficult. And again, the departments just don't have a lot of time to have to kind of push that back into the box to see how it compares with other bureau requests across the department. One of the things, again, going back to the base budget, that's important is to make a clear explanation of the increases and decreases, and really be quite forthright on which changes are up to the agency's control and which aren't, and being really kind of hard-nosed about that, not trying to claim something is outside of the agency control when maybe the agency does have some control over it, and really separating those things. And also, this is also where your budget object classes can help bring those things out. Are your FTE totals consistent with your personnel expenses? There should be a pretty tight alignment there based on the type of and positions and grades that make up your agency. Is the travel consistent? Is it not asking for excessive amounts, or are the amounts used explained and really driven down? Travel gets a lot of attention because it's travel, not because it necessarily is a lot of money. So just know that going in. Contracts, there's clear ties to specific tasks and deliverables, what the agency wants to accomplish. There's no sort of, well, what's this contract for? How does it really support the agency? That needs to be worked out and be explained in your budget request. Rent costs consistent with space requirements. Do you have space that maybe can be repurposed either to another bureau or for some other use? Maybe that's something your agency or bureau can take a look at. It should include management initiatives to improve efficiencies and reduce costs. Again, the idea that you're using the money as wisely and as prudently as possible. The reasonable person test. What would a reasonable person look at this and think this cost is reasonable, or could it be improved upon? Can efficiency be improved? And then also the response to management issues. If you've had GAO or IG reports that lay out weaknesses or deficiencies, what are you doing to address those? And it may not require new funding to do that. It may be other changes, but we need to be take those head on and really deal with them and show how the agency is responding to close those gaps or close those findings. The new initiatives. So these are the idea that many departments will take that base plus incremental approach. So a new initiative says, okay, we've done this in the past. This is something new or something more we want to do. And it's really important to describe those in kind of the three classical indicators. What's the cost? What's the performance? In other words, what will it achieve or provide? And capability, in the sense that does the agency have the experience or skills to implement the initiative? Can they really spend the money on this thing? So let's first look at cost. It's a budget, so what this thing's going to cost is going to be an important number. What are the implementation cost estimates? In other words, what does it cost to start this project? What are the operating cost estimates? Studies have shown over and over that almost 80% of a system's life is spent in the operation and maintenance phase, even though some of the upfront numbers seem really big, but it's when it's been out in service for 20 years that it really costs money. So those estimates need to be at least grappled with. and then break those out by BOC to show where those costs will be spent. Will they be spent in equipment? Will they be spent in contracting support? Exactly what it's going to take to make this work. The other thing to make sure you're capturing the full cost of the initiative. Like we said, the overhead type things or the support type things. Is your initiative going to require, let's say, additional HR analysts to bring on a major cadre of new work classification? Or, in one of my previous agencies, we had guidance to double a workforce. Well, to double the workforce in the president's, objective, that policy guidance, it took a lot more than just those particular employees. It took people to hire them, people to interview them for the selections and things of that nature. So we had to come up with a holistic initiative to achieve that political objective. And also information required to assess the cost impacts on other programs. Okay, if you double your workforce out in the field, is that going to have an impact on your space requirements? Do those people need some place to work? Are they going to need additional equipment to work with? Again, it's very important to make sure that an initiative has a holistic cost that captures all those parameters. Performance. So I think of this as answering the question, what do we get for the money? So what is the agency going to do? What will this initiative do for the agency, for the department, and for the government, writ large? Why would I want to, if I'm your appropriator, make this money available to you because of what I'm going to get for it? So that's really got to be worked out and clearly stated, and really worked with the performance office, especially in your performance plan. If you've got a clear element that you're trying to address, then make that linkage to show we believe these resources will lead to an improvement in this performance initiative. Capability. Can the agency execute the funding in the meaningful time period? And meaningful meaning lines up with the appropriation. If this is something the agency has never done before, then that needs to be factored into the initiative request. Maybe it needs to have a prototype phase. Maybe it needs to have a low rate production phase where you kind of try things out before you move to the big acquisition. Or major process changes needed to realize the projected outcomes. I'm always, as a budget analyst, a little wary of, we're going to do this great big thing we've never done before and have no experience with, but we're going to do it perfectly the first time. Maybe that's maybe the initiative needs to be structured a little bit more realistically to kind of, crawl, walk, run before the agency can go ahead and spend hundreds of millions of dollars on something. Has the agency done something similar where they can demonstrate that? Hey, we did this a little bit, maybe we did this in one region and now we want to take this to other regions nationwide, and can demonstrate that and talk about it. So those are important points to include in an initiative request. So a quick question, what are the major drawbacks of zero-based budgeting? Yeah, I'm seeing some good answers. Detail and account for every dollar, time consuming, difficult to include common costs. That's the place, one of the places I've really seen it hard to do because, those, as I said, and I used to say, unless a program wants to have to like enter their purchase card every time they send an email, they need IT support. And, how is that going to be allocated, especially things like IT security? There's just no cutting back on that. But that's got to be allocated to all the programs in order to support it. So how is that factored into a zero-based budgeting approach? So good. Those are all good responses. Thank you. Andy, over to you.
Okay, so we talked about how to do a base budget request, but now we're going to talk about how to do an initiative, which is something beyond the base. Now, even in very, very, very tough budget times, like I think we're living through now, they maybe need to ask for an increased funding for some particular thing. It might be an investment in a new system. It might be to carry out a presidential priority. And so it's very important if you're making a request, especially in a tough budget time, to make it an effective request, which means it's going to be capable of getting serious consideration by the political leadership. And so a good budget request will answer these 7 questions. The first one is, what is the value proposition for the proposed initiative or initiatives? You got to show that it has a value for the American people. And then, how do proposed initiatives align with the leadership and stakeholder priorities? Like, you might think it's a good idea, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that the idea aligns with the political leadership and what their priorities are. And then you have to have evidence that creates what I call a reasonable belief that this idea will actually work, that it will do what you hope it does. And then you have to be able to explain, especially in this environment, what is the initiative going to cost? What is the cost of the initiative? So that's number 4. Number 5, the question will be, does this request generate the best possible return of investment? Merely having a positive return on investment is not enough because you're competing for scarce dollars. It has to be the best possible return on investments. And then you need to address the risk and how will they be motivated. And then you have to answer, like, how will this be sold? Both to the political leadership. So if you're in a bureau, you have to sell it to the department, and then the department has to sell it to OMB, and then OMB and you have to work together to sell it to the Congress. So it has to be sellable. So next slide. So let's just go through these 7 questions and talk a little bit more about them. So what's a value proposition? It's an easy to understand reason why the request should be approved that answers 3 questions. What is the outcome that will be achieved? Is it lower cost? Is it a service for the American people? How will it be achieved? There has to be a how, and then you have to have the cost. Those are the 3 elements. If you can say those things in the famous elevator speech, like explain it in the time it takes to go up 5 floors in an elevator, or to the grandparents' speech, can you explain it to your grandparents? Because the value proposition has to be easy to understand and very focused. Next slide. So the second, a logic model is a good tool and to help you formulate a value proposition. The logic model is a graphic display that describes the relationship between the resources required, the inputs, the activities, the outputs, the outcomes, and the impact. So if you can do this process for your initiative and work it out internally, then from this, you should be able to derive your value proposition. If you can't, if this thing becomes some long, complicated thing that you can't make sense of, then you got to question whether the idea is actually worth pursuing. So a logic model can be the source of a value proposition. Next slide. So then you got to ask, how do proposed initiatives align with the leadership and stakeholder priorities? So if the administration or the political leaders have said they don't want X, don't propose X or whatever it is. Make sure that that whatever you're proposing aligns with political leadership. And we've been hammering that home throughout this process, this class. Next slide. But you got to have evidence that creates a reasonable belief that the initiative will work. So you have your logic model, and you have to have evidence that each step in the model, that the activities that you perform actually will deliver the outputs, and that the outputs will create outcomes, and things like that. So, but it boils down to a cause and effect relationship, right? And there's a law, Evidence-Based Policy Act, and other things that can help you use evidence to establish that, hey, if we do X, we're going to get Y. And that's important to think through, because if you can't have that, again, they'll punch holes on it. Remember, it's OMB's job to punch holes in your budget initiatives, and it's the department's job to punch holes because they don't want things to go through that they'll get embarrassed on the Hill or embarrassed at OMB if in the case of the department. So next slide. So OMB in the old version had evidence requirements. We'll see what the new administration puts forth. Next slide. Then you got to ask, what will the initiative cost? And the keys to this are persuasive cost estimates. And a cost estimate to be persuasive needs to be transparent. It needs to identify all the costs, and they need to be clearly presented. Now, it's really bad if you get to OMB hearing, right, and you're presenting your initiative to OMB, and they say, well, did you think about this cost? And you didn't. It throws the whole credibility of your whole presentation into doubt. And so therefore, it's got to be clear transparency on what are all the costs. It has to be realistic, based on rigorous cost estimates. And GAO and in DoD, they have pretty clear methodologies on how to do that, and you should consult those. And it has to be consistent. 3, between the base and the initiative costs. So if you have a type of employee in the base that earns $100,000 a year, in the initiative, you can't have them earning $20,000 a year. And it has to be consistent across programs. So for things like contracts and supplies and, of course, personnel. Next slide. And these are the documentations on the cost estimating procedure. There's the GAO cost estimating and assessment guide. And then I just put a book here that describes the DoD process. But again, there's 4 characteristics: comprehensive, cover all the costs, well document, show your work, be accurate, and be credible. And that will give you the ability to at least show OMB or their department that you're credible on the cost estimate front. Next slide. And another tool to use is this concept of work breakdown structure, where you identify all the activities in the proposed initiative and you show logically how they go to create the output. And GAO has detailed instructions on how to do this that can be useful for building a budget bureau request. Next slide. Again, does this proposal generate a return on investment, right? Because remember that budget decisions are always competitive because there's always a ceiling on how much can be requested or how much can be approved. And so you're competing against other proposals and you need to make sure that it's competitive. So you want to ask, how does the return on investment compare with other possible uses of funds, including returning the money back to the taxpayers? And you have to show that the benefits are demonstrably better than those offered by competing proposals. And you have to ask, what are the negative effects that could happen, especially for infrastructure investments? What happens if you don't have an IT system that monitors student loans or things like that? A clear statement of ROI is essential for an effective proposal because leaders are going to calculate an ROI when they compare proposed projects, right? They'll do it in their head or they'll do it in their own way if you don't provide them with the information to do it, because that's what they have to do, right? They're making decisions. So you don't want to leave that up to the leader. Give the leader the information that allows the leader to make the decisions. And beware of bias in decision making when they're rushing fast. Next slide. And then there's economic return on investments that translates outcome into a dollar value, and then you compare it to the cost. And this is very appealing to business-oriented political leadership. If you can show that you're providing a return on investment for the taxpayer dollar, that will be considered, help your case. But ROI claims do face skepticism. That's just a true fact. You go in and tell them, oh, I'm going to generate a huge benefit, because we're going to increase the economy by this or that. That will be looked at skeptically. So you have to be rigorous and plausible. Avoid outlandish claims. Everybody's going to look at those hard. And remember, there are different ROI measures are used for different initiatives, and be consistent how you're doing it. So don't use one methodology for one request and another for another, because people think you're cherry picking methodologies. Be consistent across all your requests. Next slide. So how do you demonstrate ROI for non-economic goods? Now, this is really hard because how do you translate goods into dollar values, like a person's health, nature's beauty, a historical monument? How do you translate that into dollars? Well, you do have to kind of describe the value in narrative terms and then use some financial criteria, non-financial criteria, like the number of people impacted, the amount of suffering avoided, and you can do some emotional appeals. But you still have to think in terms of ROI, even for initiatives that involve non-financial things. Next slide. Always identify the risk. Don't leave the risks to either the reviewers. So like if you're a bureau submitting a request to the department, if the department figures out a risk that you didn't think of, that again will destroy the credibility of your request, right? And there is a risk formula you can apply. So be transparent about the risk. Don't try to think you could sneak a risk past either the department or OMB or Congress. Somebody's going to figure it out. So you have to deal with it up front. You have to describe the strategy to mitigate risk, especially focus on those with catastrophic loss, high prospective loss, because that, if you don't do that, that will scare people away from the initiative you're proposing. And if you can't mitigate the risk, maybe it's a bad initiative and you shouldn't be proposing it. So you have to think about risk. Next one, next slide. And you can use the logic model to work and the work breakdown structures to identify risk, because you can look at each step in the process and see what are the things that can impact whether that activity can be accomplished according to the standard needing to make the proper output. So you can look at things like, do you have the proper staffing? Do you have infrastructure you need? Is there a supply chain issue? Is the organization capable of performing the work? Does it have an effective process? Is there things that might disrupt it? And again, is there a logic in the performance, and what are the unanticipated consequences? Look at all these risks, and the logic model can help you identify those and think through these risks. So a logic model with the work breakdown structure is a key tool that you should learn about and learn to use in your budget formulation requests. Next slide. So again, you got to have a strategy for selling the initiative, right? You have to identify the key stakeholders, understand message themes that will help persuade stakeholders. You have to tell a coherent story, strive for your elevator speech, keep it simple, avoid jargon, relate it to real experiences, and do not be afraid to appeal to human emotion with powerful human experience. Next slide. So the agency will, the next step in the process is, we're working through a process here. The bureaus have submitted their request to the agency. So now the agency is going to review the bureau budget requests. And so if you're now working in budget formulation in a department or agency budget office, you're getting all these requests in, right? And it's your job to review them. And so you have to, one thing to do is just, did they answer the 7 questions we just went over there, right? If they have gaps, then you need to shoot the holes in the gap. And you need to send it back for rework or just disapprove the initiative or make a recommendation to disapprove the initiative. That's part of your job, because if you're in the Department of Budget Office and the initiative gets approved and goes to OMB and it gets shot down at OMB, that's kind of your failing, right? You should be every bit as smart as OMB, and you should know what OMB is going to ask. And so you should shoot it down before it gets to OMB or send it back for rework so it can pass through the standards. So you also got to ensure quality. Is the request ready for OMB and Congress? If you're in the department reviewing bureau requests, you need to make sure that it adds up. I mean, I've seen, like at OMB or in a review with the CFO, where somebody comes in with a request and the numbers don't add up. Well, that just again throws the credibility out the window, and it does not get approved. And then you have to make the evidence. You have to ask, does the evidence in the narrative create a compelling case for the requested funds? And if they don't, you send it back for rework or you just recommend it disapproved. You have to test the claims, right? You have to test the logic model. If they say X is going to happen because of Y, or Y is going to happen because of X, look at that critically. And how do you do that? Well, you look for program evaluation studies. You look for research and literature. You look for prior experience. Because if you don't do it and you're in the department, OMB probably will do it at their level. Look at the feasibility, look at the organization's ability to execute the capability to do what you're trying to do. Like if you have some big expansive program, are they really able to do that? Even if it's a good idea, can they do it? And then of course you must prioritize during the review process. You have to say what things are more important than others. And then ultimately a budget analyst should make a recommendation on what level of budget authority should be requested. What should this initiative request be approved, or should it be rejected for insufficient evidence or whatever reason? Okay, next slide. And I just wanted to throw out this book. I like it. There's basically, when you're presenting the recommendations to your leadership, or your making a presentation for a budget request, avoid these errors. Make sure you have a clear point. It's a lot of presentations. I think you've all sat through them in your career where you're like, what, 5 minutes in, you're like, what's the point of this? Make sure that the audience understands the benefit. Make sure there's a logical flow. And see, again, if you have a logic model, it will help you sequence the flow of ideas in your presentation. This last one, too detailed, data dumps, obscure key logic, and most persuasive facts. Look, you're a budget analyst, so you're into the details. You understand it, and you love the details. And sometimes there's a temptation to go show our work. We want to show off what great budget analysts we are to our executives. And so we clutter up the presentation with a lot of, this is how I got this number, this is how I got that number. And that just confuses it just obscures your key points. So learn to present to decision makers and have your information in the background if they ask ideas, but keep it focused on business decision makers. And also decision makers have a lot on their mind and they want to move to the next thing. So don't make it too long, don't make it too boring. Focus on keeping it moving. Next slide. So now the agency decision process. So the analyst has reviewed the budget requests and made recommendations, and now you're moving into the actual decision process. Now, who makes the decisions? Now, we're in a new administration and there's new ways of doing things, but traditionally in a department, the budgets were put together by the deputy secretary, right? Or maybe the chief of staff, or maybe some sort of senior advisors. But it's the budget staff's job to organize the decision process so that they get the right information to the right leaders at the right time to make good decisions. But the process must be responsive to the needs of leadership. And you have to understand what kind of information your leaders desire. Some leaders really want to do deep dives into the data. They really want to know all the details and understand the in-depth logic of what you've done, what you recommend. But other leaders need just the minimum to make high-level decisions, and you have to adapt to them. If you have a leader that wants to focus at the high level, don't waste time trying to drag them down into the details of data. Meet them where they want to be met. That's your responsibility. Work with the political leadership to determine who's involved in the decision process. Some leaders want small, close-hold decision meetings. Others want larger, more inclusive meetings. Design your process, the budget process, to meet the needs of leaders. Regardless of the leadership style, but the budget office has the responsibility of ensuring that decision makers have the best available information. And that means making sure the data is correct, right? Do not let errors go, because that can confuse a leader and lead to bad decision makers. And making sure that the narratives are clear and compelling, that explain the data, that they explain the data. Budget staff must always be viewed as fair umpires and not policy advocates. If you become a policy advocate, you're going to lose credibility because you can't be the fair umpire. It's your job to organize the process so the appropriate viewpoints get to the decision makers. It's the decision makers' job, the political leadership job, to be the policy advocates, and therefore try to be fair to all the relevant, and keyword there is relevant, points of view. And the political leadership will help you determine what's relevant. Next slide. So then you prepare the OMB submission. And this means you take the agency decisions, your leaders make decisions, and then you are now supposed to follow OMB guidance as directed in OMBA 11 and what other informal guidance you get from your budget examiner, and you pass that on up to, and you turn in your submission to OMB. And again, make sure there's a compelling case. Anticipate and prepare for OMB questions. Understand the president's priorities. Make sure you can explain why your initiative is consistent with the president's policy, or even why your budget's consistent with the president's policy. So look at things like past presidential statements, testimony before Congress by political leaders, and look at previous year's meetings from OMB. Next slide. So question, what are the ways a budget initiative can demonstrate that it's likely to deliver the intended outcome? Just give you a minute to type.
After this, Andy, you want to take a 5-minute break?
Yeah, let's do that. I think we want to take a 10-minute break.
Okay.
Or let's just do 5 minutes. We're kind of, let's do 5 minutes because we're coming to the end and we want to cover all the material. So we'll be back at 3:35, we'll call it. We'll call it an 8-minute break, 3:35. Okay, we'll start in a minute. Everybody hear me?
Yep. Next
Yeah.
section is
can hear
still you, Andy.
Okay, I'm going to finish. I'm going to take us home. So hang in there when we do the last few minutes. And appreciate you hanging with us so far. But now we're to the stage. Now, where we are in the process is the agencies have made and the departments have made their decision and they've submitted their OMB submission. So you might wonder what happens to this. You send all this document and all this data and all these narratives over to OMB. What do they do with it? So that's what we're going to talk about for the last 25 minutes of our time together. And the first step is that the OMB examiners review the submissions, and they're going to ask the same questions that the department budget analysts ask. Do the numbers add up? Are they compelling? Is it consistent with the president's priorities and things like that? And then what happens at OMB is they'll call in hearings. And now it depends on the agencies how they do this, but the OMB examiners and their bosses bring the agency staff over and they have a discussion where usually the agency makes a presentation and then the OMB examiners ask questions. And so that's the happens usually in October. And then there's something called director's review where the director is briefed and makes final decision. Then they prepare the passback, which is the official communication from OMB to the department about what their funding will be. And then there's an appeal and final settlement. So we're going to talk about these steps in the next few minutes. So next slide. So let's first take a step back and look at OMB. So what is their role in the budget formulation process? Well, they review agency budget requests, they evaluate program effectiveness and efficiency, they analyze and estimate the budgetary impacts of policy options, they develop proposals to support presidential priorities, and they think about trade-offs across agencies and policy areas, and ultimately they produce the president's budget documents, those big 4 volumes that we showed you earlier in this training. So next slide. So let's take a minute to understand how OMB is organized, right? Because the OMB does do things beyond just budget formulation. So they have statutory offices on the right box there, where the Office of Federal Financial Management, and they set financial management standards. There's the Procurement Office that sets procurement policy, e-government and information technology, and a very important Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which manages the regulatory process for the government and sets the policies and procedures for the formulation of regulations. So those offices are important, but they don't necessarily impinge on a day-to-day basis on the budget formulation process. And you have some OMB-wide offices over there on the left: the Budget Review Division, Economic Policy, Legislative Reference, and then General Counsel and Personnel. So the Budget Review Division is a super important organization because they put together OMB's Circular A11 and they set up the process and manage the process of formulation for OMB. They're the process wonks and the data wonks. Economic policy sets the economic assumptions, which are obviously important for the budget process because that drives, how much things are going to be cost and spending and things like that, for things like what is the inflation rates that we're going to assume, what is the unemployment rate we're going to assume, what is the economic growth rate we're going to assume, what are the interest rates we're going to assume for building the budget. But what you mostly will deal with if you work in a departmental budget office or a bureau budget office is the resource management offices of OMB. And what OMB has done is they divided the government into 5 areas that are listed below there that you can read. And these are the area divisions that handle the budget formulation, in the sense that they're the ones that are reviewing the budget requests. They're the ones that put together the passback, and they interact. They're the interface between the departments and the director of OMB. So the key players: there's the director, who's Senate confirmed member of the president's cabinet. The deputy director is Senate confirmed and serves as the deputy. Then there's something called a program associate director, which is a political appointee that heads an RMO. And you'll hear the phrase PAD. And so there's a PAD for national resources and each one of the other four RMOs. Now, assisting a PAD is a deputy associate director, which is a career employee who leads a division within an RMO. So the RMOs are subdivided into various divisions, and each division has a DAD who reports to the PAD. Get that? The Deputy Associate Director DAD reports to a Program Associate DAD. Program Associate Directors are political appointees. Deputy Associate Directors have traditionally been career appointees. And then within a division, there's branch chiefs, who are kind of like the team leads. And then below them, the people doing the work, are the budget examiners. And these are usually very highly trained people with 3 to 5 years experience. They have graduate degrees, and they tend to be very hard working and very motivated. So that just gives you a sense of what OMB is. Let's go to the next slide. So what is OMB doing their review process? How does that work? So in September, the budget examiners review the budget requests. They meet with the agencies and hold hearings, and they analyze the budget, and they ask the questions. And here's where you got to get through the examiners, because it's their job to poke holes in your request and make sure that your request is up to snuff and compelling. And they prepare for the director's review. And then usually in late October, OMB begins an extensive oral briefing and decision process with the director that is referred to as director's review. So at this point in the stage, the OMB examiners and their boss is the branch chief, and their boss's boss, the deputy associate directors, they go in and jointly make recommendations to the director. And that can be a significant emotional event for OMB staff, because this is where the decisions are made. And so the director's review process is used to present options, including how they should reduce the agency budget requests due to budget constraints, or cut out things that don't defend the presidential priorities and stuff like that. They analyze program performance, and they look for better ways to do the government's work. They balance the individual agency resource needs against the totals, the spending goals for the president. And then they craft the legislative and funding proposals that will implement the administration priorities. And then they make recommendations to get agency budgets down to the guidance levels. So if an agency submits a budget that's above guidance levels, it's the examiners that will make the recommendations how to cut it down to that level. So next slide. So again, director's review in a normal fall session. So what's happening now is they're having some sort of director's review now, because we're on an abbreviated late cycle because the president's budget, due to the transition. But they have separate sessions for each major agency with the director, and sometimes they group together smaller agencies for a session. And then they have sessions on overview topics like the economic assumptions, cross-cutting priorities, things like anti-drug activities, counterterrorism, and other issues. And then they put together issue papers that describe pros and cons for funding alternatives. And they make recommendations about major issues associated with each agency's budgets. And the issue papers generally address new policy initiatives. And that's where you're going to get the thumbs down or the thumbs up for your initiative request, changes to base programs, and management initiatives that have a budgetary impact. So that's what happens in director's review. Next slide. Then the OMB makes the final decision. The director obviously makes the decision, and for big issues, the director may consult with the White House. Back in my day, Dick Cheney had a big influence. The vice president had influence in things. So they consult with the White House, but the director then presents the decisions. The decisions are given to the OMB examiners, who prepare a passback document. And this is a document that goes from OMB to the department or agency, right? And it's a written document that outlines the decisions, and it tells the agencies how to incorporate these decisions into the MAX A11 database. And it also provides the foundation for the written materials that will form the president's budget document. So the president's budget document, the narrative in the president's budget, but it also has to inform the congressional justifications put together by the departments. In a normal process, the goal is to have passback by Thanksgiving and resolve any appeals by Christmas. So there is an appeal process, and it's usually very, very short. Next slide. Okay, we covered that. Next slide. So there is an appeals process. OMB usually allows a very short time for agencies to appeal passback. Sometimes it's 5 days, but usually no more than 5 days. And so agencies then have to think about, the departments and agencies have to think about, what are they going to appeal? And so if you appeal everything, you're just wasting your time, because they'll just deny it across the board. So it's really important to pick the few highest things that will have critical impacts and only appeal for those. And a good appeal shows the impact of a failure to improve the appeal. You have to persuade OMB to approve your appeal. Senior political leaders sometimes will make appeals directly to the OMB director. So a secretary may actually go in person to talk to the OMB directors. And then that's where it gets very, the political leaderships make their interactions and make their decision. And so, but at the bottom here, I just put a sample passback schedule for an agency. And so the first thing that you can do is they have to produce summaries for the agency leadership. So you get the passback, and you got to go brief the senior leaders. And then it goes down to the components, and they start talking to examiners and asking questions and begin drafting appeals. And then on day 2, there's a very quick appeal process where the budget director goes in and briefs for like an acting secretary and things like that. Then on day 2 or 3, you make the final decisions, and finally you submit it on day 4. So this is a very intense, very rapid decision-making process, which again, to be effective, only focuses on the highest priority few items. Next slide. So final settlement. Final settlement is what, that when no more appeals, no more discussion, pencils down, this is the decision. This reflects the final decisions that then are now put into the president's budget and the congressional justification materials. It's very important to make sure you understand what the final decision is, get it documented, get it communicated, so you don't have people writing CJ chapters that don't reflect the final decisions. Most decisions are made at the pad level. Critical decisions are elevated to OMB, but ultimately, sometimes the president and the vice president will get involved with specific things. But it's key to make sure that everything your department produces, or agency, if you're an independent agency, is consistent with final settlement, because you do not want to produce a document that is not consistent with the decisions made by the political authorities. That does not go well. Next slide. Question: what is one of OMB's roles in the budget process? So what is OMB's roles? We listed several of them. I know it's late. Present reasonable evidence. Okay. They do passback. They listen to hearing appeals. Okay, good. They review budget requests. Good. They do the appeals process. Okay. So the last thing we're going to do is spend about 5 minutes talking about budget production and rollout. So next slide. So budget production, there's really 2 pieces of it here. First piece on the top there is the max data entry. So now you have the decisions. You have to go enter those decisions, or the data reflective of those decisions, into the max system. And that means the decisions are at top lines. So you have to allocate that down for things like budget object classes, specific programs, for the program tables that we talked about. You have to have the FTEs, and all this information has to be entered in max in a way consistent with the final settlement decisions. And so that's a major piece of work for a budget office. But then you also have to draft the congressional justification. And this is the chapters, the big books produced by the department. And you have to make sure, though, that all the tables and all the narrative are consistent with the final settlement. So LMB then reviews the CJs. They go line by line. And again, what they're asking is make sure everything in it is consistent with the president's decisions. And then you prepare some rollout materials. So typically, the max data entry can start for what the prior year and the current year before final settlement. And then you get final settlement, and then you have to rush to get those numbers in the max. And then you have to produce the documents in December and January. Okay, next slide. So we talked about max data entry already. So we're going to just move on past this. And we talked about preparing the agency congressional justification. And I just want to take a minute to talk about what makes a good CJ. They do provide detailed financial program and performance data to justify the president's budget request to Congress. The appropriators staff is the primary, the appropriations staff is the primary audience of a CJ. You're giving them the information they need to make decisions. But authorizing committee staff will look at it, and what's known as personal staff. So just quick review, in Congress, there's appropriations committees that do appropriations, and then there's an authorizing committee that looks at that sets up the structure and does mandatory spending. And so all of those committees have interest in the CJs. And personal staff are the staff that just work for a senator, in the personal capacity, or a congressman. But stakeholders also pay attention to CJs. The interest groups and even agency personnel will they'll read the CJs to find out what the decisions were made. So again, I'm emphasizing this. All data presented in the CJ must be consistent with data presented in the president's budget appendix. So let's talk about what works. Keep in mind the different audiences. But remember, this is a justification of estimates for Appropriations Committee. So sometimes they ask for some very convoluted stuff, and you think, well, why does the public care about that? That doesn't matter. The CJ is for the Appropriations Committee. And then appropriators want to know how the funding was spent, because they want to know how it was spent last time, and the plan for how it will be spent. Appropriators, if you're proposing something new, they want you to make the case for it. Just like you had to make the case for it at the department, then you had to make the case for it at OMB. Now in the CJ, you have to communicate that case. Look at both numbers and narratives are important. Don't put in extraneous information. One of the things that happens in CJs is they clutter it up with too much information. For example, they want to list all the great things the agency did in the last year. You'll have 6 pages of bullet points. Well, appropriators staff aren't going to read that. So keep it focused. Congressional staff keep asking, if congressional staff keep asking for certain data and information every year, in the hearings, go ahead and put it in the CJ to get that done. Keep it brief. What does not work? Incorrect information. Make sure everything adds up. Asking for the same thing over and over again when the Congress has refused it. Including little information on a program proposed to be eliminated in the president's budget. Inundating the reader with information, giving too much stuff. Providing information in a different way than it's appropriated. And updating the same tables and information year after year without asking why it's included. So these are just some things to think about. We've just got a couple of minutes. Are there any questions? You're going to appreciate you sticking through to the end. If not, I'm going to turn it over to Janice and we can wrap up.
Whew, thank you, Andy and Rick. Let's give them a hand clap, heart, some kind of reaction. Thank you so much. It's been a long day, but an awesome job. Want to say thank you to all of you that have joined us for our first day of the 4th annual Budget LoB Intro to Budget Form. There will be Tomorrow, there will be 4 sessions. The first one will be reading appropriation laws. If you don't have the link to that, I will drop that in the chat box. Other than that, thank you so much for joining us on behalf of Budget Line of Business. We hope to see you in the morning. Not enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Have a nice evening. You look so pretty.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you,
Thank you
Janice.
so
And